very serious examination of how they had misused theology in order to promote patriotism. And out of this came a determination in many churches, in most churches I would say, to separate the pastoral mission from questions of citizenship, and to turn citizenship issues over to the lay groups that might be associated with a church, whereas the pastoral mission had to do with the individual problems. This is something we'll get into when we discuss religion more. But critically, when World War II came, the National Council of Churches made it very clear that the churches were not going to use the war, not going to make patriotic statements. They were not going to repeat what they did in the First World War. And newspapers as well did a very thorough self-examination and came to the conclusion that they had failed in their most basic requirements as newspaper reporters. They had not reported information that they actually had because they worried that it would be injurious to the war effort. They did not want to give the American public any information which might be confusing or sad even. And they accepted whole cloth anything that the British and French governments, any information that the British and French governments had provided them, most of which turned out to be lies. Not even just exaggerations, but out and out lies. That they had become a propaganda arm for the government, not doing journalism. So all of this, the 1920s begins with a sense of why did we do this? We did this, and the simple-minded explanation was we did it because the British wanted us to, the Wall Street bankers wanted us to, the munitions industries wanted us to. If we just returned to our simple American ways, we would have been fine. And so this is part of a process of turning inward, which I think was also reinforced by the fact that the internal economy was growing. There was so much investment that needed to be done still to realize the natural and the physical and natural and resources of the country, as well as what could be produced through investment in machinery and labor, that the country went in a sense into a major economic period of internal economic investment. Now, when you go back to magazines from the 1920s and books, looking for discussions of what made America a special place, what you find I'm going to turn off the projector. What you find is an emphasis on material standard of living. But it's not simply having stuff. It's that this is widely distributed. It's not simply that there's cars, but even regular people have cars. Liberty, freedom, democracy are invoked, but the U.S. had what made the U.S. really special was that people were benefiting from its material wealth, and there was a spreading of prosperity in many directions. And this material wealth, in some sense, people thought did in fact make the United States distinctive. In the 19th century, the people in the United States certainly thought that the United States had a superior political and economic system. But they would concede that the United States was culturally backward, primitive. By the 1920s, liberal democratic governments were to be found in every part of the world. Not everywhere, but in every part of the world. So the kind of representative democracy that the United States had was no longer unique, nor was the market system unique. But what did seem to be unique was the extent to which material wealth was distributed. Nationalism was expressed first and foremost through a celebration of the productive capacity of the American people, which I think you can see in those the first three films, reflected in the first three films. The federal government was still small. It really hardly existed in anybody's lives outside of the post office. And in many areas, it was either non-existent or it lacked legitimacy. Most people looked to state and local government to provide the necessary services that they wanted, to provide the services that private enterprise couldn't provide. And this meant that oftentimes patriotism was very local rather than all-encompassing and national. Historians who have looked at American patriotism in the 1920s, the commemoration of national holidays, and the construction of memorials to fallen soldiers or to pioneers, find that the celebrations of American nationalism strongly avoided references to central government or to national institutions. Each locality was the site of the American nation, and you celebrated the American nation as you understood it, what you saw in Berkeley or Santa Rosa or Stockton or Santa Monica. That was what you experienced on an everyday basis. Going to work, going to church, going home was the American nation. Going to the store. You didn't need to worry about what was going on across the country. And Americans did not particularly look to the central government for direction. If they saw a problem, they took it up for themselves through local government or state government. The most important element in the American way was actually the rather sudden expansion in consumer goods that changed how people lived every day. Material progress seemed to be what was unique about life in the United States. Now, that can be read as a Philistine celebration of stuff. And many contemporary critics, particularly in Europe, poked fun at American materialism. But in the American media, which of course is promoting American materialism and consumer society, the explosion of new goods was taken as a chief example of democracy in action. I think you hear a little bit about that from that in Calvin Coolidge's speech, that it's the ability of the American citizen to spend his money, or her money, as he or she chooses. That is a hallmark of democracy, not as government chooses. It's not so much that Coolidge was a small government Republican in the sense that we understand today. That would be misunderstanding where Coolidge was coming from, but we'll get into that later. The American way was very much a celebration of what corporations could provide consumers, but in some ways acting as if the corporations weren't really there, that it was like the automobile ferry that brought automobiles to us. So the ideology of Americanism in the 1920s was very much the ideological triumph of large-scale private enterprise over the radical producerism of that had been so prevalent in the United States in the 1870s and the 1880s, in the period at which we begin this course. In the 1920s, the question became almost literally large-scale corporations or socialism. The third way had not, or a third way had not yet appeared. Now, Nathaniel, but this was not, even though it was about stuff, it's important to remember that stuff is about what people want to do and about how they frame their desires. There's a line in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables, in which he has a character who just got out of prison after 30 years, and he rides in a train. Trains at this time were like 15 years, had been in the United States 15 years, and the train goes all of 15 miles an hour, so we wouldn't even think of it as anything. But the character is amazed, and the character says, trains are the spiritualization of travel. It's that you could imagine doing something, and now you are doing it. And the inventions were seen as an ability to, as a way of extending what people really would like to do if they were able to. So if we look at something as simple as the telephone, which we could talk of after Hawthorne as the spiritualization of communication. Well, what does that mean? Telephones were introduced in the last quarter of the 19th century, so after 1875. Given how expensive phone communication was initially, businesses were the primary customers as well as government. They were valuable in situations where immediate communication was necessary to resolve a problem. So it was worth it to a business for a manager to have in the central office to talk to the sales manager 500 miles away and figure out what needed to be done today. It had to be a problem that a letter that needed to be resolved more quickly than a letter or a telegram. But more quickly than a letter, but might require more detailed discussion than a telegram would allow. For most Americans through the 19th century into the 20th century, letters remained the primary way that you communicated with friends and family with whom you were separated for one reason or another. You simply could not, and you did not expect to have a personal conversation with a close friend whenever you wanted to, or with your parents. When you went off to college, your parents might be in Santa Barbara and you're here at Berkeley. You didn't talk to each other for 9 months. It was as simple as that. Maybe that's happy making for some people. But efficient use of telegrams could facilitate communication of urgent news. And in the cities, we know that telegrams were used by the middle class to confirm dinner dates and things like that, instead of calling somebody up on the phone. So telephones